Chapter E.3.2 of the Anarchist FAQ. How does economic power contribute to the ecological crisis? So far in this section, we have discussed why markets fail to allocate environmental resources. This is due to information blocks and costs, lack of fully internalized prices and externalities, and the existence of public goods. Individual choices are shaped by the information available to them about the consequences of their actions and the price mechanisms. Blocks essential aspects of this, and so information is usually partial as best within the market. Worse, it is usually distorted by advertising and the media, as well as corporate and government spin and PR. The local knowledge is undermined by market power, as well as corporate and governments, leading to unsuitable practices to reap maximum and short-term profits. Profit is the only decision-making criteria leads to environmental destruction, as something which may be ecologically essential may not be economically viable. All this means is that the price of a good cannot indicate its environmental impact, and so that market failure is pervasive in the environment area. Moreover, capitalism is as unlikely to produce their fair substitution of environmental goods as many more than any other good or resource due to the differentiation in income and so demand, particularly as it takes the existing distribution of wealth as a starting point. The reality of our environmental problems provides ample evidence for this analysis. During this discussion, we have touched upon other key issues, namely how wealth can affect how environment and other externalities are produced and dealt with in a capitalist system. Here we extend our critique by addressing an issue we have deliberately ignored until now, namely the distribution of wealth and its resulting economic power. The importance of this factor cannot be stressed too much, as market advocates at best downplayed, or worse, ignored or denied exists. However, it plays the same role in environmental matters as it does in, say, evaluating market freedom within capitalism. Once you factor in economic power, the obvious conclusions in the market-based solutions to the environment will result in, as with freedom, people selling it simply to survive under capitalism, as we discussed in section 8.4, for example. It could be argued that strictly enforcing property rights so that polluters can be sued for any damages made will solve the problem of externalities. If someone suffered pollution damage on their property which they had not consented to, then they could issue a lawsuit in order to get the polluter to pay compensation for the damages they have done. This could force polluters to externalize the costs of pollution, and so the threat of lawsuits can be used as an incentive to avoid polluting others. While this approach could be considered a part of any solution to environmental problems under capitalism, the sad fact is it could ignore the realities of the capitalist economy. The key phrase here is not consented to, as it means that pollution would be fine if the others agree to it, in return, say, for money. This has obvious implications for the abilities of capitalism to reduce pollution. For, just as working people consent to hierarchy within the workplace in return for access to the means of life, so would they consent to pollution? In other words, the notion that pollution can be stopped by means of private property and lawsuits ignores the issues of class and income inequality. Once these are factored in, it soon becomes clear that people may put up with externalities imposed upon them simply because of economic necessity, pressure big business can inflict. The first area to discuss is inequalities in wealth and income. Not all economic actors have equal resources. Corporations and the wealthy have far greater resources at their disposal and can spend billions of pounds in producing PR and advertising, propaganda, fighting court cases, influencing the political process, funding experts and think tanks, and, if need be, fighting strikes and protests. Companies can use a mix of cover-up, publicity campaigns, and legal maneuvers to continue operations unimpeded. They can go to court and try to block more stringent political controls. David Watson and against the mega machine. Also, while in principle the legal system offers equal protection to all, in reality, wealthy firms and individuals have more resources than members of the general public. This means they can employ a large number of lawyers and throw out litigation procedures for years, if not decades. This can be seen around us today. Unsurprisingly, the groups which bear a disproportionate share of environmental burdens are the poorest ones. Those at the bottom of the social hierarchy have less resources available to fight for their rights. They may not be aware of the rights in specific situations and not organized enough to resist. This, of course, explains why companies spend so much time attacking unions and other forms of collective organization which change the situation. Moreover, as well as being less willing to sue, those on lower incomes may be more willing to be bought off due to their economic situations. After all, tolerating pollution in return for some money is more tempting when you are struggling to make ends meet. Then there is the issue of effective demand. Simply put, allocation of resources on the market is based on money and not need. If more money can be made in, say, meeting the consumption demands of the West rather than the needs of local people, then the market will efficiently allocate resources away from the latter to former regardless of social and ecological impacts. Take the example of biofuels, which have been presented as a means of fueling a car in a less environmentally destructive way. Yet this brings people and cars into direct competition over the most efficient, profitable use of land. Unfortunately, effective demand is on the side of the cars, as their owners usually live in the developed countries. This leads to a situation where land is turned from producing food to producing biofuels, the net effect of which is to reduce the supply of food, increasing its price and so produce an increased likelihood of starvation. It also gives more economic incentive to destroy rainforests and other fragile ecosystems in order to produce more biofuel for the market. Green socialist John O'Neill simply states the obvious. The treatment of efficiency as if it were logically independent of distribution is at best misleading. The determination of efficiency already presupposes a given distribution of rights. A specific outcome is always relative to an initial start point. If property rights are changed, so also is what is efficient. Hence, the opposition between distributional and effective and efficiency criteria is misleading. Existing costs and benefits themselves are the product of a given distribution of property rights. Since costs are not independent of rights, they cannot guide the allocation of rights. Different initial distributions entails differences in whose preferences are to count. Environmental conflicts are often about who has the right to environmental goods and hence who is to bear the costs and who is to bear the benefits. Hence, environmental policy and resource decision-making cannot avoid making normative choices which include the question of resource distribution and the relationship between conflicting rights. Claims the monetary value of a negative externality depends on the social institution and experiences of the higher income groups, making them more important than the lower ones. If the people are damaged are poor, the monetary measure of the cost of damage will be lower. The poor sell cheap, from markets to liberation and environment. Economic power also impacts the type of contracts people make. It does not take too much imagination to envision the possibility that companies may make signing waivers that release it from liability condition for working there. This could mean, for example, a firm would invest or threaten to move production only on the condition that the local communities and the workers sign a form waiving the firm of any responsibility for damages that may result from working there or from its producing process. In the face of economic necessity, the workers may be desperate enough to take the job and sign the waivers. The same would be the case for local communities who tolerate the environmental destruction they are subjected to simply to ensure that their economy remains viable. This already happens with some companies, including clauses in their contracts, which state that employees cannot join a union. There is a threat of legal action by companies. Every year, records bring Share and Better, thousands of Americans are sued for speaking out against governments and corporations. Multi-billion-dollar lawsuits are being filed against individual citizens and groups for circulating petitions, writing to public officials, speaking of, or even just attending public meetings, organizing a boycott, and engaging in peaceful demonstration. This trend has led to other countries, and the intent is the same, to silence opposition and undermining campaigns. This tactic is called SLAP, for strategic lawsuits against public participation. It is a civil court action which does not seek to win compensation, but rather aims to harass, intimidate, and distract their opponents. They win the political battle, even when they lose the court case, if their victims and those associated with them stop speaking out against them. This is an example of economic power at work, where the cost to a firm is just part of doing business, but could bankrupt an individual or environmental organization. In this way, the legal system best serves those who have large finance resources at their disposal. In such cases, take an average of 3 years to be settled, even if the person who sued wins. It costs tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, emotional stress, disillusionment, diversion of time and energy, and even divisions within families, communities, and groups can also result from global Spain. A slap usually deters those already involved from continuing to freely participate in debate and protests, as well as deterring others from joining. The threat of court cases in the face of economic power usually ensures that slaps do not go to trial, and so its objective of scaring off potential opponents usually works quickly. The reason can be seen from one case in which a slap backfired, namely the McLibel trial. After successfully forcing apologies from major UK media outlets like the BBC, Channel 4, and The Guardian by threatening legal action for critical reporting of the company, McDonald's turned its attention to the small eco-anarchist group London Greenpeace, which is not affiliated with Greenpeace International. The group had produced a leaflet called "What's Wrong with McDonald's?" and the company sent spies to its meetings to identify people to sue. 2 of the anarchists refused to be intimidated and called McDonald's bluff. Representing themselves in court, the 2 unemployed activists started the longest trial in UK history. After 3 years and a cost of around $10 million, the judge found that some of the claims were untrue. Significantly, McDonald's had successfully petitioned the judge not to have a jury for the case, arguing that the issues were too complex for the public to understand. While the case was a public relations disaster for the company, McDonald's keeps going as before, using the workplace practices exposed in the trial, and remains one of the largest corporations, confident that few people would have the time and resources to fight slaps. Although the corporation may now think twice before suing anarchists. Furthermore, companies are known to gather lists of known troublemakers. These black lists of people who could cause companies trouble by union participating or suing employees over property rights issues would often ensure company loyalty, particularly if new jobs need references. Under wage labor, causing one's employer problems can make current and future positions difficult. Being blacklisted would mean no job, no wages, and little chance of being reemployed. This would be the result of continuing assuming independence of one's property rights, assuming, of course, that one had the time and money necessary to sue in the first place. Hence, working class people are in a weak position to defend their rights under capitalism due to the power of employment both within and without the workplace. As these are strong incentives not to rock the boat, particularly if employees have signed a contract ensuring they will be fired if they discuss company business with others, lawyers, unions, and media. Economic power producing terrible contracts does not affect just labor. It also affects smaller capitalists as well, as we discussed in section C4, rather than operating efficiently to allocate resources within perfect competition. Any real capitalist market is dominated by a small group of big companies who make increased profits at the expense of their smaller rivals. This is achieved in part because their size gives such firms significant influence on the market, forcing smaller companies out of business or into making concessions to gain profits and market contracts. And the negative environmental impact of such process should be obvious. For example, economic power places immense pressure towards monoculture and agriculture. In the UK, the market is dominated by a few big supermarkets. These suppliers are expected to produce fruits and vegetables which meet the requirements of the supermarket in terms of standardized products which are easy to transport and store. The large-scale nature of the operations ensures that farmers across Britain, indeed the world, have to turn their farms into suppliers of these standardized goods, and so the national diversity of nature is systematically replaced by a few strains of fruits and vegetables over which the consumer can pick. Monopolization of markets results in the monoculture of nature. This process is at work in capitalist nations. In America, for example, the centralized purchasing decisions of the large restaurant chains and their demand for standardized products have given a handful of corporations an unprecedented degree of power over the nation's food supply, obliterating regional differences, and spreading identical stores throughout the country. The key to a successful franchise can be expressed in one word: uniformity. This has resulted in the industrialization of food production, with the fast food chains now standing at the top of a huge food industrial complex that has gained control of American agriculture. Large multinationals dominate one commodity market after another. The fast food chains' vast purchasing power and their demand for a uniform product have encouraged fundamental changes in how cattle are raised, slaughtered, and processed into ground beef. These changes have made meat packing into the most dangerous job in the United States. And the same meat industry practices that endanger those workers have facilitated the introduction of deadly pathogens into America's hamburger meat. Eric Schlosser and fast food. Award-winning journalist Eric Schlosser has presented an excellent insight into the centralized and concentrated food industrial complex in his book Fast Food Nation. Schlosser, of course, is not alone in documenting the fundamentally anti-ecological nature of capitalism and how an alienated society has created an alienated means of feeding itself. As a non-anarchist, he does not fail to draw the obvious conclusion, namely abolish capitalism, but his book does present a good overview of the nature of the process at work and what drives them. Capitalism has created a world where the smell and taste of food is mass-produced, as the industrialization of agriculture and food processing has led to the product. It is hard to call it food, becoming bland and tasteless, and so chemicals are used to counteract the effects of producing it on such a scale. It is standardized food for a standardized society. As he memorably notes, billions of people at that very moment were standing at the same country ordering the same food from the same menu, with the taste of the same everywhere. The Orwellian world of modern corporate capitalism is seen in all its glory, a world in which the industry group formed to combat Occupational Safety and Health Administration regulation is called Alliance for Workplace Safety, and where the processed food's taste has to be the correct mouthfeel. Unsurprisingly, the executives of these companies talk about the very existence of freedom, and yet their corporation's first commandment is that only production costs. The employer's duty is to follow orders, period. In this irrational world, technology will solve all our problems, even the ones it generates itself. For example, faced with the serious health problems generated by the industrialization of meat processing, the meatpacking industry advocated yet more technology to solve the problems caused by the existing technology. Rather than focusing on the primary causes of meat contamination, they proposed irradiating food. Of course, the firms involved want to replace the word irradiation with the phrase cold pasteurization due to the public being unhappy with the idea of their food being subject to safe radiation. All this is achievable due to the economic power of fewer and fewer imposing costs on their workers, customers, and ultimately the planet. The next obvious factor associated with economic power are the pressures associated with capital markets and mobility. Investors and capitalists are always seeking the maximum returns and given a choice between lower profits due to greater environmental regulation and higher profits due to no such loss. The preferred option will hardly need explaining. After all, the investor is usually concerned with the returns they get in their investment, not in its physical condition nor in the overall environmental state of the planet, to someone else's concern. This means that investors and companies invested in moving their capital to areas which return the most money, not which have the best environmental impact and legacy. Thus, the mobility of capital has to be taken into account. This is an important weapon in ensuring that the agenda of business is untroubled by social concerns and environmental issues. After all, the owners and managers of capital consider that a state's environmental laws are too restrictive, then it can simply shift investments into states with a more favorable business climate. This creates significant pressures on communities to minimize environmental protections both in order to retain existing businesses and attract new ones. Let us assume that a company is polluting a local area. It is usually the case that capitalist owners rarely live near the workplace they own, unlike workers and their families. This means that the decision makers do not have to live with the consequences of their decisions. The free market capitalist argument would be, again, that those affected by the pollution would sue the company. We will assume that concentration of wealth have little or no effects on the social system, which is highly unlikely assumption but never mind. Surely, if local people did successfully sue, the company would be harmed economically, directly in terms of the cost of the judgment, indirectly in terms of having to implement new eco-friendly processes. Hence, the company would be handicapped in competition, and this would have obvious consequences for the local and wider economy. This gives the company an incentive to simply move to an area that would tolerate the pollution if it were sued or even threatened with a lawsuit. Not only would existing capital move, but fresh capital would not invest in an area where people stand up for their rights. This, the natural result of economic power, would be a big stick over the heads of the local community. And when combined with the costs and difficulties in taking a large company to court, it would make suing an unlikely option for most people. That such a result would occur can be inferred from history, where we see that multinational firms have moved production to countries with little or no pollution laws, and that court cases take years, if not decades, to process. This is the current situation on the international market, and there is competition in terms of environmental laws. Unsurprisingly, industry tends to move to countries which tolerate high levels of pollution, usually because of authoritarian governments which, like the capitalists themselves, simply ignore the wishes of the general population. Thus, we have market and pollution laws, which, unsurprisingly, supplies the ability to pollute to meet the demand for it. This means that developing countries are nothing but a dumping ground and a pool of cheap labor for capitalist corporations. Obsolete technology is shipped there along with the production of chemicals, medicines, and other products banned in the developed world. Labor is cheap, there are few any safety standards, and costs are cut. But the formula of cost-benefit still stands. The costs are simply borne by others, by the victims of Union Carbide, Dow, and Standard Oil. David Watson. This, it should be noted, makes perfect economic sense. If an accident happened and the poor actually managed to successfully sue their company, any payments would reflect their loss of earnings. Not very much. As such, there are other strong economic reasons for doing this kind of pollution exporting. You can estimate the value of production loss because ecological damage and the value of earnings lost. There is related health problems as well as healthcare costs. This makes it more likely that polluting industries will move to low-income areas or countries where the costs of pollution are correspondingly less, particularly compared to the profits made in selling the products in high-income areas. Rising income makes such goods as safety, health, and the environment more valuable, as the value of life is for working people based on their wages. Therefore, we would expect pollution to be valued less when working-class people are affected by it. In other words, toxic dumps will tend to clutter around poor areas, as the cost of paying for the harm done would be much less. The same logic underlies the arguments of those who suggest that third world countries should be dumping grounds for toxic industrial wastes, since life is cheap there. This was last seen in early 1992 when a memo that went out under the name of the chief economist of the World Bank, Lawrence Summers, was leaked to the press. Discussing the issue of dirty industries, the memo argued that the World Bank should be encouraging more mitigation of the dirty industries. Less developed countries, and provided 3 reasons. Firstly, the measurements of the cost of health impairing pollution depends on the foregone earnings from increased morbidity and mortality, and so pollution should be done in the country with the lowest cost, which will be under the country with the lowest wages. Second, that underpolluted countries in Africa are vastly underpolluted, and that air quality is probably vastly inefficient below compared to Los Angeles or Mexico. Thirdly, the demand for a clean environment for aesthetic and health reasons is likely to have a very high income elasticity. Concern over pollution-related illness would be higher in a country where more children survive to get them. Also, much of the concern over industrial atmospheric discharge is about visibility impairing particulates. Clearly, trade in goods that embody aesthetic pollution concerns could be welfare enhancing. While production is immobile, the consumption of pretty air is not tradable. The memo notes the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. It ends up by stating that the production with the arguments against all these proposals for more pollution in the third world could be turned around and used more or less effectively against every bank proposal for liberalization. While Summers accepted the criticism for the memo, it was actually written by Lane Pritchett, a prominent economist at the bank. Summers claimed he was being ironic and provocative. The economist unsurprisingly stated his economics was hard to answer, while criticizing the language used. This is because clean growth may be slower than allowing population pollution to occur. This would only stop helping millions of people in third world countries to escape their poverty. So not only is poisoning the poor with pollution economically correct, is in fact required by morality. Ignoring the false assumption that growth, any kind of growth, always benefits the poor, and the utter contempt shown for both the poor themselves and our environment, what we have here is a cold logic that drives economic power to move location to maintain its right to support our common environment. Economically, it is perfectly logical, but in fact totally insane. This helps explain why making people think like an economist takes so many years of indoctrination within university walls, and why so few achieve it. Economic power works in other ways as well. A classic example of this is at work can be seen from the systematic destruction of public transport systems in America from the 1930s onward. See David St. Clair's The Motorization of American Cities for a rail research account of this. These systems were deliberately bought by automotive, General Motors, oil, and tire companies in order to eliminate a less costly, both economically and ecologically, competitor to their automobile. This was done purely to maximize sales and profits for the companies involved. It had transformed the way of life in scores of cities across America. It is doubtful that if environmental concerns had been considered important at that time, that they would have stopped this from happening. This means that individual consumption decisions will be made within a market whose options can be limited simply by a large company buying out and destroying alternatives. Then there is the issue of economic power in the media. This is well understood by corporations who fund PR, think tanks, and experts to counteract environmental activism and deny, for example, that humans are contributing to global warming. Thus, we have the strange position that only Americans think there is a debate on the cause of global warming, rather than a scientific consensus. The actions of corporate funding experts and the PR have ensured that particular outcome. As Sharon Vetter recounts in her book, The Global Spin, The Corporate Assault on Environmentalism, a large amount of money is being spent on a number of sophisticated techniques to change the way people think about the environment, what causes the problems we face, and what we can and should do about it. Compared to the resources of environmental and green organization, it is unsurprising that this elaborate multi-billion-pound industry has poisoned public debate on such a key issue for the future of humanity by propaganda and disinformation. Having substantial resources available means that the media can be used to further an anti-green agenda and dominate the debate, at least for a while. Take an example, The Skeptical Environmentalist, a book written by Bjorn Lomborg, political science and professor of statistics at the University of Aarhus in Denmark. While it was published in 2001, it caused sensation within its claims that scientists and environmental organizations were making, at best, exaggerated and, at worst, false claims about the world's environmental problems. His conclusion was Panglossian in nature, namely that there is not that much to worry about and we can continue as we are. That, of course, was music to the ears of those actively destroying the environment, as it reduces the likelihood that any attempts will be made to stop them. Unsurprisingly, the book was heavily promoted by the usual suspects and, as a result, received significant attention from the media. However, the extremely critical reviews and critiques of it subsequently produced from expert scientists on the issue, while more discussed, were less prominently reviewed in the media at all. The critics of the book argued that it was hardly an example of good science based on objectivity, understanding the underlying concepts, appropriating statistical methods, and careful peer review goes without saying. Sadly, the fact that numerous experts in the field Wambe discussed showed that his book was seriously flawed, misguided data and statistics marred by flawed logic and hidden value judgments, was not given anything like the same coverage, even though his information is far more important in terms of shaping public perception. Such works and their orchestrated media blitz provides those with a vested interest in the status quo with arguments that they should be allowed to continue their anti-environmental activities and agenda. Moreover, it takes up the valuable time of those experts who have to debunk the claims rather than do the research needed to understand the ecological problems he faced and propose possible solutions. As well as spin and propaganda aimed at adults, companies are increasingly funding children's education. This development implies obvious limitations on the power of education to solve ecological problems. Companies will hardly provide teaching materials or fund schools which educate their pupils on the real causes of ecological problems. Unsurprisingly, a 1998 study in the U.S. by the Consumers Union found that 80% of teaching material provided by companies was biased and provided students with income or slanted information that favored sponsors' products and views. The more dependent a school is on corporate funds, the less likely it will be to teach its students the necessity to question the motivations and activities of business. That business will not fund education which it perceives as anti-business should go without saying. As Sharon Better summarizes, the infiltration of the school curriculum through banning some texts and offering corporate-based curriculum material and lesson plans in their place can conflict with the educational objectives and also with the attainment of an undistorted understating of environmental problems. This indicates that the real problem with purely educational approaches to solving the ecological crisis, namely that the ruling elite controls education either directly or indirectly. That is to be expected, as any capitalist elite must control education because it is an essential indoctrination tool needed to promote capitalist values and to train a large population of future wage-owning slaves in the proper habits of obedience and authority. Thus, capitalists cannot argue to lose control of the educational system. This means that such schools will not teach students what is really necessary to avoid ecological disaster, namely the dismantling of capitalism itself. Thus, we need to add alternative schools organized by libertarian unions and other associations which use libertarian education to produce anarchists would hardly be favored by companies and so be effectively blacklisted, a real deterrent to their spreading through society. Why would a capitalist company employ a graduate of a school who would make trouble for them once employed as their wage slave? Finally, needless to say, the combined wealth of corporations and the rich outweighs that of even the best funded environmental groups or organizations, or even all of them put together. This means that the first idea of such groups buying, say, rainforests is unlikely to succeed as they simply do not have the resources needed. They will be outbid by those who wish to develop the wilderness regions. This is particularly the case once we accept the framework of economic self-interest assumed by market theory. This implies that organizations aiming to increase the income of individuals will be better funded than those whose aim is to preserve the environment for future generations. As recent developments show, companies can and do use that superior resources to wage war for hearts and minds in all aspects of society, starting in the schoolroom. Luckily, no amount of spin can nullify reality or the spirit of freedom, and so this propaganda war will continue as long as capitalism does. In summary, market solutions to environmental problems under capitalism will always suffer from the fact that real markets are marked by economic inequalities and power. Anarchist FAQ, Chapter E.3.3. Can capitalism's focus on short-term profitability deal with the ecological crisis? No. The word no. This is another key problem associated with capitalism's ability to deal with the ecological crisis it helps create. Due to the nature of a market, firms are forced to focus on short-term profitability rather than long-term survival. This makes sense. If a company does not make money now, it will not be around later. This obviously drives the creation of externalities discussed in the previous section. Harmful environmental effects such as pollution, global warming, ozone depletion, and destruction of wildlife habitat are not counted as costs of production in standard methods of accounting because they're borne by everyone in society. This gives companies a strong incentive to ignore such costs such as competition forces firms to cut as many costs as possible in order to boost short-term profits. To give an obvious example, if a firm has to decide between installing a piece of costly equipment which reduces its pollution and continues as it currently is, then it is more likely to do the latter. If the firm does invest, then its costs are increased, and it will lose its competitive edge compared to its rivals who do not make similar investments. The rational decision is therefore not to invest, particularly if by externalizing costs it can increase its profits or market share by cutting prices. In other words, the market reward is the polluters, and this is a powerful incentive to maximize such activities. The market profitability. While this is rational from the firm's position, it is collectively irrational as the planet's ecology is harmed. The short-term perspective also can be seen with the tendency of firms to underinvest in developing risky new technologies. This is because basic research may take years, if not decades, to develop, and most companies are unwilling to take on that burden. Unsurprisingly, most advanced capitalist countries see such work funded by the state. As we know since Section 8, over 50% of total research and development funding has been provided by the federal state in the USA. Moreover, the state has provided markets for such products until such time as markets have appeared for them in commercial sectors. Thus, capitalism by itself will tend to underinvest in long-term projects. In a competitive system, you do short-term planning only. Let's take corporate managers. Where there is no real confusion about what they're doing, they are maximizing profit and market share in the short term. In fact, if they were not to do that, they would no longer exist. Let's be concrete. Suppose that some automobile company, say General Motors, decides to devote their resources to planning for something that will be profitable 10 years from now. Suppose that's where they divert their resources. They want to think in some long-term conception of market dominance. Their rivals are going to maximize profits and power in the short term, and they're going to take it over the market, and General Motors won't be in business. That's true for owners and for managers. The managers want to stay managers. They can fight off hostile takeover bids, they can keep from being replaced as long as they contribute to the short-term profitability. As a result, long-term considerations are rarely considered in competitive systems. Noam Chomsky in Language and Politics. This does not mean that the firms will not look into future projects or do research and development. Many do, particularly if helped by the state. Nor does it imply that some industries do not have a long-term perspective. It simply shows that such activity is not the normal state of affairs. Moreover, any such long-term perspective is rarely more than a decade. while an ecological perspective demands more than this. This also applies to agriculture, which is increasingly being turned into agribusiness as small farmers are being driven out of business. Short-termism means that progress in agriculture is whatever increases the current yield of a crop, even if it means destroying the sources of fertility in the long run in order to maintain current fertility by adding more and more chemicals, which run off into rivers, seep into the water table, and end up in the food itself. This kind of irrational short-term behavior also affects capital markets as well. The process works in the same way, Chomsky highlights. Suppose there are three companies X, Y, and Z, and suppose that company X invests in the project of developing a non-polluting technology within years. At the same time, its competitors Y and Z will be putting their resources into increasing profits and market share in the coming days and months over the next year. During that period, Company X will be unable to attract enough capital from investors to carry out its plans, since investors will flock to the companies that are most immediately profitable. This means that the default position under capitalism is that the company or country with the lowest standards enjoys a competitive advantage and drags down the standards of other companies or countries. Sometimes, though, capital markets experience irrational bubbles. During the dot-com boom of the 1990s, investors did plow money into internet startups and losses were tolerated for a few years from the expectation of high profits in the near future. When that did not happen, the stock market crashed and investors turned away from that market in droves. If something similar happens to technologies, the subsequent aftermath may mean that funding essential for redressing our interaction with the environment will not be forthcoming until the memories of the crash have disappeared in the next bubble frenzy. Besides, thanks to compound interest benefits so far in the future have a very small present value. If $1 were left in a bank at 5% the annual interest rate, it would be worth more than $2 million after 300 years. So if it costs $1 today to prevent ecological damage worth $2 million in the 24th century, then economic theory argues that our descendants would be better off with us putting that $1 in the bank. This which suggests that basing our responsibility on future generations of economics may not be the wisest course. The supporter of capitalism may respond by arguing that business leaders are able to see long-term negative environmental effects as the rest of us, but this is to misunderstand the nature of the objection. It is not that business leaders are individuals are any less able to see what's happening to the environment. It is that they want to keep their jobs, they have to do what the system requires, which is to concentrate on what is the most profitable in the short term. Thus, if the president of a company X has a mythical experience of oneness with nature and starts diverting profits into pollution control, while the president of Y and Z continue business as usual, the stockholders of company X will get a new president who is willing to focus on short-term profits like Y and Z. As Joe Biden stresses, members of corporations have a legal duty to put shareholders' interests above all others. Corporate social responsibility is thus illegal, at least when it's genuine. Ones who choose social and environmental goals over profits to try and act morally are in fact immoral, as their role in both the economy and economic ideology makes as much money as possible for shareholders from the corporation. In general, then, if one company tries to devote resources to develop products or processes that are ecologically responsible, they will simply be undercut by other companies which are not doing so. Assuming such products or processes are more expensive, as they generally are, as the costs are not inflicted on other people on the planet. While some products may survive in small niche markets which reflect the fact that many people are willing and able to pay more to protect their world, in general, they will not be competitive in the market, and so the ecologically damaging products will have the advantage. In other words, capitalism has a built-in bias towards short-term gain, and this bias, along with its inherent need for growth, means the planet will continue its free fall towards ecological disaster so long as capitalism exists. This suggests that attempts to address ecological problems like pollution and depletion of resources by calling for public education are unlikely to work. While it is true that this will raise people's awareness to the point of creating enough demand for environmentally friendly technologies and products that they will be profitable to produce, it does not solve the problem that the costs involved in doing such research now cannot be met with a possible future demand. Moreover, the cost of such technology can initially be quite high, and so the effective demand for such products may not be sufficient. For example, energy-saving light bulbs have been around for some time, but have been far more expensive than traditional ones. This means that for those on lower incomes who would, in theory, benefit most from lower energy bills could not afford them. Thus, their short-term income constraints undermines long-term benefits. Even if the research is complete, the market itself cannot stop products being used. For example, the ability to produce reasonably inexpensive solar photovoltaic power cells has existed for such time. The problem is that they are currently very expensive, so there is a limited demand for them. This means that no capitalist wants to risk investing in a factory large enough to take advantage of the economy of scale possible. The net effect is that short-term considerations ensure that a viable eco-technology has been marginalized. This means that no amount of education can countermand the effective market forces in the short-term perspective they inflict on us all. If faced with a tight budget and relatively expensive ecological products and technology, consumers and companies may be forced to choose the cheaper, ecologically unfriendly products to make ends meet or survive in the market. Under capitalism, we may be free to choose, but the options are usually lousy choices, and not the only ones potentially available in theory. This is a key product with great consumerism. See section 5. The short-termism of capitalism has produced, in effect, a system which is a massive pyramid scheme that will collapse somewhere down the line when all the major players have already retired from the game. Of course, unless of these hustlers cash in their chips, there won't be any place left to retire to. David Watson.